This story was sent to me by Sarah Chen via email. I was running through the crowded streets of Milan at 2 in the morning, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. Behind me, I could hear footsteps matching my pace, getting closer with every step. But let me back up and tell you how this all started. I was 23 and working as a freelance photographer, trying to make it in the fashion industry. Milan Fashion Week 2018 was supposed to be my big break. I had saved up for months to afford a tiny apartment near the Quadrilatero della Moda for the week, hoping to catch some street-style shots and maybe network with industry professionals. I had been following Fashion Week for years online, dreaming of being part of this glamorous world. The first few days went exactly as planned. I spent my mornings at coffee shops near the major venues, photographing models and influencers heading to shows. The energy was incredible. Everyone was dressed to impress, even just walking down the street. I managed to get some decent shots and even had a brief conversation with a casting director who seemed interested in my work. On my 4th night there, I was walking back from a late dinner around midnight when I noticed the same man I had seen earlier that day outside the Prada show. He was tall, maybe in his 40s, wearing an expensive-looking coat and designer glasses. What caught my attention was that he was holding a professional camera similar to mine. I had noticed him because he seemed to be photographing the same models I was, but from a distance, almost hiding behind pillars and corners. Now here he was again, about 50 feet behind me as I walked down Via della Spiga. At first, I told myself it was just a coincidence. Milan Fashion Week attracts thousands of photographers, and we all tend to frequent the same areas. But when I turned left onto Via Sant'Andrea and he followed, then right onto Via Borgo Spesso and he was still there, I started to feel uneasy. I decided to test my suspicions. I ducked into a late-night gelateria and watched through the window. He stopped across the street, pretending to look at his phone, but I could see his eyes were fixed on the shop entrance. My stomach dropped. This wasn't a coincidence. I stayed in the gelateria for 20 minutes, nursing a small cup of pistachio gelato I didn't want, hoping he would get bored and leave. The elderly owner kept giving me concerned looks, probably wondering why this young woman was sitting alone looking terrified. When I finally worked up the courage to leave, the man was gone. Relief flooded through me as I quickly walked the remaining blocks to my apartment. But as I turned the key in the building's front door, I heard a voice behind me. "Excuse me, you dropped this." I spun around, and there he was, holding out a lens cap that definitely wasn't mine. His smile was too wide, too eager, and he was standing way too close. "That's not mine," I said, trying to keep my voice steady while fumbling with the door lock. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key to work. He stepped even closer, close enough that I could smell his cologne, something expensive and overwhelming. What made his voice had this slimy quality that made my skin crawl. The way he said "collaborate" made it clear he had something else entirely in mind. I finally got the door open and tried to slip inside, but he grabbed the door frame, preventing it from closing. "Wait, don't be so unfriendly. I know you're here alone, working hard to make it in this business. It's tough for young women in fashion. You need someone looking out for you." The fact that he knew I was alone terrified me. Had he been watching my apartment? How long had he been following me? I pushed against the door with all my strength, but he was much stronger than me. "Let go of the door," I said as firmly as I could manage, but my voice came out as barely a whisper. "Come on, don't be like that. Let's go get a drink and talk about your career. I can introduce you to some very important people." His grip on the door tightened, and I realized he had no intention of letting me upstairs alone. That's when I made a decision that probably saved my life. Instead of continuing to fight him for the door, I suddenly let go and ran. I sprinted down the street as fast as I could in my photography boots, my camera bag bouncing against my hip. Behind me, I heard him curse, and then the sound of his footsteps as he gave chase. I finally spotted a taxi with its light on and practically threw myself in front of it. The driver, a middle-aged Italian man, took one look at my terrified face and immediately unlocked his doors. I dove into the back seat and begged him in broken Italian to just drive. As we pulled away, I saw my pursuer standing under a streetlight, watching us leave with that same unsettling smile. The taxi driver was incredibly kind. He drove me to the nearest police station and waited while I filed a report. The officers took it seriously, especially when I showed them the photos I had accidentally taken of the man earlier that day when he was lurking around the fashion shows. Apparently, there had been several reports that week of a man matching his description following young women in the fashion district. I never found out what happened to him, but I spent the rest of Milan Fashion Week staying with another photographer I met, a woman in her 30s who had been working the fashion circuit for years. She told me that, unfortunately, Fashion Week attracts all kinds of predators who target young women trying to break into this industry, knowing they're often alone and vulnerable in a foreign city. I did eventually build a successful career in fashion photography, but I never forgot that night in Milan. Now, I always travel with others when possible, and I've learned to trust my instincts when something feels wrong. That man taught me that the most dangerous predators are often the ones who present themselves as helpful industry contacts. I found this on a Reddit thread by user Milan Model 2018. The elevator doors closed with a soft ding, and I immediately knew I had made a terrible mistake. The man standing next to me smiled in a way that made every instinct in my body scream danger. But let me back up and tell you how I ended up trapped in an elevator with someone who I'm convinced wanted to hurt me. I was 19 years old and had just been signed with a small modeling agency in Milan. It was my first fashion week, and I was absolutely terrified, but trying to play it cool. My agency had booked me for a few small shows, nothing major, but I was determined to make a good impression and hopefully book more work for the future. The show I was heading to was in one of those modern office buildings that had been converted into a temporary venue. You know the type, all glass and steel, trying to look important, but somehow feeling cold and impersonal. The building was buzzing with activity. Models, stylists, photographers, and various fashion industry people were constantly coming and going. I had arrived early, as my agency had drilled into me to do. Never be late, always be early, and always professional, my booker had said. The show wasn't for another hour, but I wanted to check in with the casting director and maybe get a sense of the other models I'd be working with. The building's lobby was crowded with people waiting for elevators. There were at least 20 people clustered around the elevator bank, all dressed in that effortlessly chic way that Milan Fashion Week demanded. I was wearing a simple black dress and boots, trying to blend in, while secretly feeling like everyone could tell I was new to this world. When the elevator finally arrived, it was packed. I squeezed in with about 8 other people pressed against the back wall. We were going to the 15th floor, and I watched the numbers slowly climb as people got off at various floors. By the time we reached the 10th floor, there were only 3 of us left. Me, an older woman who looked like she might be a fashion editor, and a man in an expensive suit. The woman got off at the 12th floor, giving me a quick smile as she left. The doors closed, and suddenly it was just me and the man. That's when everything changed. He had been quiet during the ride up, standing near the front of the elevator, but as soon as we were alone, he turned around and looked at me in a way that made my stomach drop. His eyes moved slowly up and down my body, not in the professional way casting directors or photographers look at models, but in a way that felt predatory and invasive. "First time at Fashion Week?" he asked, his voice smooth and confident. He was probably in his 50s, with graying hair and the kind of expensive accessories that screamed money and power in the fashion world. "Yes," I reply, trying to sound professional and confident, but my voice came out smaller than I intended. I was pressed against the back wall, and he was standing between me and the control panel. I thought so. I can always tell. There's a certain innocence, a freshness. The way he said freshness made my skin crawl. He took a step closer to me, even though there wasn't much space. I smelled his cologne, something woody and overwhelming. The elevator reached the 13th floor and kept going. I realized with growing panic that he hadn't pressed the button for the 15th floor. We were going to the top of the building, wherever that was. "Excuse me, I need to get off at 15, I said, trying to reach around him to press the button. But he blocked my path, placing his hand against the wall next to my head, effectively trapping me in the corner. "The penthouse has a much better view," he said. His face was now inches from mine, and I could see the calculating look in his eyes. The elevator dinged softly as we passed the 15th floor. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. I was trapped in a metal box with this man, going to an unknown floor in a building where no one knew where I was. "I really need to get to my show," I said, trying to sound firm, but my voice was shaking. "Shows get canceled all the time. Models get sick, they miss flights, they decide the business isn't for them." His hand moved from the wall to my shoulder, his fingers digging in just hard enough to make his point clear. The elevator finally stopped, and I heard the doors slide open behind him, but he didn't move. Instead, he leaned in closer. "Now, let's go have that conversation about your future." That's when something inside me snapped. Maybe it was adrenaline, maybe it was pure terror, But I suddenly ducked under his arm and bolted for the open elevator doors. I heard him curse behind me as I ran down a hallway lined with offices, most of them empty since it was a Saturday. I found a stairwell and started running down the stairs as fast as I could. My boots echoed loudly in the concrete stairwell, and I could hear him following me, his footsteps heavy and deliberate, like he knew there was nowhere for me to go. By the time I reached the 5th floor, I was gasping for breath, but I could still hear him coming down the stairs above me. I pushed through the door into another office corridor and found myself in what looked like a law firm. There were people there, working even on a Saturday, and I've never been so happy to see fluorescent lighting and cubicles in my life. "Help me, please," I said to the first person I saw, a woman in her 30s working at a computer. "There's a man following me." She immediately stood up and asked what happened. As I was explaining, I heard the stairwell door open, and my blood went cold. But when I looked over, it was just a young guy in a delivery uniform carrying coffee. I never saw the man from the elevator again that day. The woman from the law firm called building security, and they escorted me back to the 15th floor where my show was supposed to be. I was 40 minutes late, and the casting director was not happy, but I didn't care. I was just grateful to be safe. Later, I described the man to some of the other models, and several of them knew exactly who I was talking about. Apparently, he was known for approaching young models and making similar offers. One girl told me he had cornered her at a party the year before and made it very clear that he expected sexual favors in exchange for career opportunities. I finished Fashion Week and went back home, but the experience stayed with me. I realized how vulnerable I had been, how easily someone could have taken advantage of me in that environment. I eventually did continue modeling, but I made sure to never travel alone to jobs, and I learned to be much more aware of my surroundings and the people around me. That elevator ride taught me that predators often come disguised as mentors and helpers, especially in industries where young people are trying to break in and are willing to trust anyone who claims they can help their career. This was shared with me on Instagram by Kevin Wong. The van had been parked outside my school for 3 days straight before I realized the same driver was photographing students who had been active in the protests, including me. But let me back up and tell you how I figured out I was being systematically stalked by people who wanted to destroy my future. I was a 17-year-old senior at a local secondary school in Sha Tin during the 2019 protests. Like most of my classmates, I had been participating in the demonstrations since June, but I was also one of the student organizers, helping to coordinate our school's involvement in the movement. I helped plan which protests we would attend as a group and made sure younger students stayed safe during the larger demonstrations. Our school had a pretty active student political organization, and I was the secretary, which meant I kept records of our meetings and maintained contact lists of students who wanted to participate in pro-democracy activities. I took the responsibility seriously because I believed we were fighting for our future, for the kind of Hong Kong we wanted to live in as adults. The protests had been getting more intense throughout the fall, and there was increasing pressure on students to stop participating. Some schools were threatening disciplinary action, and there were rumors that university applications were being rejected for students who had been identified as protest leaders. But we felt like we couldn't stop, that we had to keep fighting for what we believed in. I first noticed the white van on a Tuesday morning in early November. It was parked across the street from our school's main entrance, which wasn't particularly unusual, since there were always delivery trucks and service vehicles in the area. What caught my attention was that the driver seemed to be sitting inside doing nothing, just watching students arrive for classes. The van was there again on Wednesday, and this time I noticed the driver had a camera with a telephoto lens. He was being subtle about it, pretending to read something on his phone while occasionally lifting the camera to take photos of students walking by. I thought maybe he was a journalist documenting student life during the protests, so I didn't think much of it at first. On Thursday, I was walking to school with my girlfriend May and 2 other friends who were also active in our student organization. As we approached the main entrance, I saw the van again, and this time, the driver was definitely taking photos of our group specifically. When we stopped to talk to some other students, he kept his camera trained on us the entire time. That afternoon, I decided to test my theory. Instead of leaving through the main entrance like I usually did, I exited through the back gate that led to a different street. I walked around the block and approached the van from behind, pretending to be looking at my phone while actually using the camera app to zoom in and take photos of the license plate and the driver. The man was Chinese, probably in his 40s, and he had professional photography equipment spread across the passenger seat. There were also notebooks and what looked like printouts of photos attached to pages with writing. I couldn't see the details clearly, but it was obvious this wasn't casual journalism. This was systematic surveillance. That evening, I shared what I had observed with other student organizers through our encrypted group chat. Within hours, I received messages from students at 3 other schools reporting similar vans near their campuses. We realized this was a coordinated effort to identify and document student protest leaders across multiple schools in the district. The next morning, Friday, I arrived at school early and positioned myself where I could watch the van without being obvious about it. The driver arrived at exactly the same time he had for the previous 3 days, which suggested this was a planned operation with specific targets and schedules. Around lunchtime, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A second man approached the van and got into the passenger seat. They spread out papers on the dashboard, and I could see they were comparing photos to what looked like a list of names and student ID numbers. They were pointing at different photos and making notes, like they were checking off items on a target list. That evening, I shared what I had observed with other student organizers through our encrypted group chat. Within hours, I received messages from students at 3 other schools reporting similar vans near their campuses. We realized this was a coordinated effort to identify and document student protest leaders across multiple schools in the district. The next morning, Friday, I arrived at school early and positioned myself where I could watch the van without being obvious about it. The driver arrived at exactly the same time he had for the previous 3 days, which suggested this was a planned operation with specific targets and schedules. Around lunchtime, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A second man approached the van and got into the passenger seat. They spread out papers on the dashboard, and I could see they were comparing photos to what looked like a list of names and student ID numbers. They were pointing at different photos and making notes, like they were checking off items on a target list. I immediately sent a warning to our group chat. But before I could finish typing, I noticed both men looking directly at me. Somehow, they had realized I was watching them. The driver started the van and began driving slowly in my direction. I ran back into the school building and found May in the library. I explained what was happening and showed her the photos I had taken of the van and the license plate. She looked terrified and said we need to tell our parents and the school administration immediately. But I was worried that involving adults would just make the situation worse, that it would confirm I was someone worth targeting. We decided to skip our afternoon classes and leave through the back exit again. As we were walking toward the MTR station, I noticed the same white van driving slowly behind us, maintaining just enough distance to avoid being obvious to anyone who wasn't specifically looking for surveillance. May and I ducked into a shopping mall and waited there for over an hour, moving between different floors and exits to make sure we weren't being followed. When we finally left, the van was gone, but I felt like we were still being watched. Every person with a camera or phone seemed suspicious. Every parked car could be hiding someone taking photos. That weekend, I received a phone call from an unknown number. The voice was speaking Mandarin with a mainland accent, and the caller said they knew about my involvement in organizing student protests. They said they had photos of me at several demonstrations and detailed records of my activities. They offered to delete everything they had collected about me if I agreed to provide them with names and contact information for other student organizers. When I refused, the caller said they would make sure my university applications would be rejected and that my family's business would face problems with mainland suppliers. They said they knew where I lived, where my parents worked, and where my girlfriend went to school. They gave me 3 days to change my mind. I spent that entire weekend in a panic, afraid to leave my apartment and afraid to stay home. My parents noticed something was wrong, but I was too scared to tell them what was happening. I was 17 years old, and I felt like I was being hunted by people with unlimited resources and no regard for the law. On Monday, I decided to transfer to a school in a different district and withdraw from all student political activities. It felt like giving up on everything I believed in, but I was too terrified to continue. The van never appeared outside my new school, and I never received another threatening phone call. 6 months later, after I had started university, I learned that several of my former classmates had experienced similar surveillance. Some had their university applications rejected without explanation. Others had family members lose jobs or have business licenses revoked. The coordinated campaign to intimidate student organizers had been much more extensive than any of us had realized at the time. I still wonder how many other 17-year-olds were targeted that way, students who were just trying to fight for their future and ended up being systematically stalked by people who wanted to destroy their lives before they had even really begun. The scariest part is knowing that most of us never reported what happened because we were too young and too frightened to know what to do about it.